Yo hehab, yo dakinyalas lokuaxi, gatwas klanugwa, hailstich dunuchonoth. I want to start off by first acknowledging the ancestral homelands of the Malahat people. So I'm going to tell you a story of the Salmon people. This is a part of Helsik oral history that was told to me by my brother, Ajithba. In Klatsja, within Helsik territory, the people had a fish weir. And the chief had a set of twins. And in our culture, twins signify a good return of salmon that the year that they're born. And he had a boy and a girl. And the boy misused the salmon, the fish weir. He left them in there to die. He didn't let them return up the river. And he also didn't use them for food. So because of his actions, the salmon did not return to the fish weir, or to the river. And his sister became very ill, and she died. Because of this, the boy decided he needed to do something. He went to the river, and he prayed. And his prayers were heard. Supernatural forces sucked him beneath the water into the underwater realm. He was taken to the house of the salmon, and there the salmon told him of their anger for his great disrespect to the salmon. But they also offered to teach him the ways of the salmon. So he stayed there for what he thought was 4 days, and he learned the ways of the salmon. But eventually he was sent home, and as he began to move towards his village, he realized he could breathe beneath the water. He realized he had become a salmon, and suddenly he was speared. He heard crying from his mother, who recognized the copper necklace that he always wore. All the people of the village gathered because this was the first time a salmon had returned to the river in 4 years. And the mother, she called a spiritually enlightened individual, a shaman, and he showed the people the salmon with the copper necklace. He then placed a mat over top of the salmon. He spread some eagle down, and he began to pray. He began to chant, "Oh, oh, oh." He then removed the mat from the salmon, and beneath the mat was the boy. From that day forward, the boy taught his people the lessons of the salmon. He taught them that we should never waste, that we must respect the salmon. We must respect their sacrifice of their life that they give to people and to animals, to trees, and the nutrients that they bring to the forest. So this story is about the ocean. And it's backed up by recent archaeological studies that prove, that reaffirm my nation has existed in our place for at least 14,500 years. That's 8,500 years before the pyramids were ever built. I come from an ancient society. So the ocean, it's a magnificent thing. It's a life-giving force. We give it all types of names. We call it the Atlantic, the Indian, the Pacific Ocean, but in reality, there's really only one ocean, and it covers over 70% of our world. It connects us from coast to coast. So I want you all to do me a favor right now. If you could take a deep breath in and out. One more time. Take a deep breath in and out. Now just think that over 50% of the world's oxygen comes from our ocean. That it is a tremendous life-giving force to all living beings on Earth. We are all connected to the ocean, just as we're all connected to one another and to Earth. And it is this relationship that I'm here to talk to you about, this relationship that we must uphold to the ocean. So the place that I come from, on my mother's side, the Hausut Nation of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, and the Heiltsuk and the Central Coast, both have recognized this reciprocal relationship with the ocean for thousands of years. We've always realized that the ocean gives us sustenance. We worked to maintain sustainability and then enhance our food sources, our relatives. This is my grandmother, Margaret Brown. She's in her late 70s. She's a fluent Heiltsuk speaker. I talked to her about the ocean, and she told me a story of her late grandfather, Louis Hall, who worked very hard to harvest and prepare seafood for his large family. Her favorite was a'ant, dried herring eggs dipped into seal grease. Within her lifetime, she has watched her food source degrade before her very eyes. Her grandson still actively harvests the majority of her seafood, but it tastes different, the texture. Imagine going from abundance of food that's harvested from the ocean by your family within your homelands to the aisles of a grocery store. That all of a sudden your staples, your eggs, bacon, and bread, your daily coffee, it's not available to you anymore. Imagine the suffering that you would feel, the desperation of your body for the foods that you've evolved eating, your ancestors have evolved eating. And too often, the degradation of indigenous food systems is overlooked for convenience and capitalism. This has affected indigenous people's health. For example, 33%. That's 1 in every 3 people in my community now has diabetes. And that's from the rapid introduction of Western food. And poverty. But people today, up in Heiltsuk territory, along this coast, they still bachwala. They gather traditional foods, foods that have sustained us and our relationship. So I want to give you an example of what indigenous science is. So the image behind me, this is herring eggs when I talked of my grandmother liking a'ant. So, for example, when you think of ecological or seasonal indicators, so those are natural signals that tell us when it's time to harvest. And so for the moon, when the moon tips over Nusi and it's at a quarter moon, it's very small, it signifies that the herring will soon spawn. It's the Heiltsuk New Year. So this is an example of my people observing the gravitational pull and the effect the moon has on tides, because when the moon is smallest, the tides are smallest. So our science is not just based on what a lot of people deem as folklore story. It's based on a practical relationship in place. So there is a difference between indigenous knowledge, indigenous science, and Western science. So I think I'll explain that first. So the difference is indigenous science, you can't have indigenous science without having indigenous culture. We put nature at the center. Whereas Western science often distances itself from culture, and we often put man at the center of Western science. And different scientists and different indigenous people will have different opinions on this. It's controversial, but this is what I believe. And this is my grandfather, Gaia. And I asked him about these seasonal indicators, these ecological indicators, and their importance to our culture. He responded that these natural signals, they're no longer as important because our environment is changing. It's all changing. This is showing that Gaia has witnessed shifting baselines in his lifetime. He's experienced climate change firsthand within our home territory, witnessing the collapse of salmon, seal, abalone, and now our herring stocks. But what Western science is telling us is this is not rare to the Helsik people on the Central Coast, that global fish stocks are collapsing, that oxygen-deficient dead zones in the ocean are expanding, that debris and pollution are increasing. They're working really hard to figure out solutions for our relationship with the ocean, on ways we can mitigate these negative effects, these changes. So as Canada celebrated its 150 years of nationhood, a lot of Indigenous people felt the pain of 150 years of ongoing colonization. So it's this difference in experience, this difference of dichotomy that we need to overcome as a society in order to have effective management of our oceans. So up on the Pacific Northwest coast, we have great biodiversity, and it's the ocean that is the equalizing factor giving us this biological diversity. And it is this ecosystem that we need to maintain that's very rare on this planet in order to obtain our cultural diversity as coastal Indigenous peoples. So to work to mitigate the effects of the contrast in values between Indigenous science and Western science, I work for Ocean Networks Canada because I believe we can learn from both ways of thinking. We're a deep sea research facility out of the University of Victoria. We're world leading in cabled observatories. We have instrumentation in the deep sea, in coastal communities, and in the Arctic. And we're looking at our changing ocean. We're looking at climate change. We're putting instruments down and collecting 24/7 real-time data. And what I think is all people have always adapted to change. And as coastal Indigenous communities, we're also adapting to change and utilizing, for example, innovative technologies such as Ocean Networks Canada to understand our natural world. We're no longer necessarily having those long observations based in place, but we're using these technologies and our relationship with place so that we can understand what is going on in our environment. So in conclusion, I want to ask each of you to do something for the ocean, to remember our relationship with the ocean, to tell at least one other person that every other breath they take comes from the ocean. We need to honor our agreements with the ocean so she can continue to sustain us, to sustain human society, as water is life and ocean is everything. Wallace Gayasika, thank you for your time.